to everybody. My name is Obiano Joe-Ekocha, and I'm really very grateful to be part of this year's Wilberforce weekend. Of course, this year has been quite different, I'm sure, from anything else that anybody has ever experienced, but all the same, I am very grateful to be participating in this year's Wilberforce weekend. Now, I've been asked to present some hard truths, particularly exposing modern day ideological neocolonialism, which is something that for the last couple of years I have been talking about. I am a pro-life activist and a pro-life advocate, but my pro-life intervention is usually from this angle where what happens between the West and African countries, particularly African countries that are on the receiving end of humanitarian aid. So thank you much for everybody who just took it upon themselves to log online and be part of this great event. Now, the first thing I would like to point out is the actual situation across the continent of Africa. Of course, Africa has 54 countries, and things are different from one country to the other, because people always tell me, why do you always talk about Africa as if it's one country? Well, no, I don't talk about Africa as if it's one country. Africa is indeed a continent, but the truth remains, as I've traveled through various African countries and various African regions, that the situation is quite similar from one country to the next. It's quite similar from one culture to the next. People speak different languages, people belong to different religions, their situations different from one to another, but still there are common threads that run through across the various African traditions and customs and cultures. One of it, in fact, being this sentiment of protection of human life. Wherever I have gone, whatever language they speak, you still find these very common sentiments pertaining to human life and human sexuality and family and motherhood, issues such as that. So it's always quite encouraging for me to see how people, even in this modern day, speak about life and motherhood and pregnancy across different African countries. Now, but also there's another reality about Africa that many of you who are listening today may not be surprised about, is the widespread poverty and the economic difficulties, which a lot of which is caused by the corruption, the level of corruption we see, among politicians in various countries and in our systems, our judicial systems, and some of the things that have been quite difficult, again, across the different African countries in very similar ways. Sometimes you find places and communities where children do not have good access to education. So the level of enrollment, for example, in primary and secondary school, and of course university, is very low. Unemployment is quite high. There are also places where some of the systems have broken down, the healthcare systems. We've had various epidemics in different African countries, particularly one that many of you may be familiar with is the Ebola crisis, and I always like to point to that to show how the healthcare system in Africa will in fact be almost collapsed with the weight of any kind of epidemic or pandemic, and that shows the weakness of the systems that we have in the various African countries. So these are the realities, these are the difficulties that have continued to place Africa in this position where we always come across looking poor and wretched, even though it's not the situation in every single community across different African countries. Of course, there are wealthy people, of course, there are businesses, there are people who are enjoying the system, but it's not really widespread, and many things have broken down, and these are some of the root causes of the mess that we see when the worst of Africa is shown, which of course is in the suffering of the African people in many places. So because of this problem, because of this general picture that I have painted now, which is widespread poverty, which is the inequality within our communities, which is the weakness, it seems, within our things like our judicial system and our law enforcement system, the security and unemployment and all of that. That is when we then find the international community constantly talking about Africa. Anybody that has anything to do with the United Nations or, say, World Health Organization, of course, which is kind of part of the UN, we always find that Africa is the topic of many conversations. We're always being talked about. They're always pointing at us. There's always Africans that need one thing or the other. So Africa has, for many years now, I think, in fact, I would say from shortly after our independence, which came around the 1960s, Africa has continued with non-stop to be a topic of conversation, about our situation, about the humanitarian crisis out there. So that has then brought us to this point where certain Western nations, in one community together, they have now approached us as donors, as these people called donors. And sometimes too, I do know that there are private donors and people who come through charities and things like that. But, on a larger scale, the African people get Western donations through, a particular community of about 35 countries plus the EU who approach us and give us aid. Now, I am not going to come all out to condemn humanitarian aid because I am African. Even though I live in the United Kingdom now, I was born and raised in Africa I was in Africa until I finished university, and I was already working in a hospital. So I know very much about what has happened or what continues to happen in the community that I come from. I know the lapses and the lacks and the inequities and the limitations, the great limitations within our education system, for example, healthcare system, and so on and so forth. So yes, the need is there. Yes, the difficulties have continued and have not yet eased in any reasonable way, has not improved over time. So I applaud the people who come through various charities, various religious groups, various organizations that are genuinely interested in alleviating the suffering of people in various African countries, people who organize medical missions, people who organize scholarships and adopt children from afar and sponsor them through these wonderful educational sponsorship programs. We have all of that. I've seen it working. I have seen it succeeding. I know people personally whose lives have been touched or who have been saved from one situation or another by Western donors who have come through these channels. People who genuinely wish to do good and people who genuinely intend to do good, and in many ways they do. Now, but it doesn't change the reality of the fact that these kinds of effective, yes, they are effective. A lot of the medical missions actually do attain at the end what it sets out to attain. A lot of the educational programs, they do set out, and to attain what eventually they want to attain, which is to ensure that African kids or people within various African communities get through school, that where they would not have had access to that kind of education. But the reality is that these kinds of programs, organized normally by small groups, by small charities, by churches from the West, they make up only a tiny drop, if you can call it that, a drop in an ocean of what is the larger pie of humanitarian aid funding that comes to Africa. Unfortunately, the biggest donors who donate money to the tune of billions of dollars, millions and billions of dollars, those who make up those who make up this kind of funding, or who come with this kind of funding, come from three major groups. So they are the nations, they are the private foundations, the philanthropic private foundations, as well as the high budget, well-funded Western organizations. So I'm talking about organizations like, say for example, International Planned Parenthood Federation, or Plan, or there are several, PSI, I think the population group, the Population Council. There are some of these organizations that are very high budget. Of course, they cannot be compared to the medical missions that come with some thousands of dollars, much needed, maybe $100,000, maybe $1 million, but they can never compare to the people who bring in almost the entirety of the $50 billion worth of funding that comes to Africa every year through donors. So our major donors come in these three categories. Now, the problem is, in the last couple of years, these our major donors are now beginning to come through their aid with putting in their ideas and their ideologies. So they are coming with funding towards African nations, but they also have particular intentions that are very clear within their projects. They come with already authored projects, all done up in Western nations, and they bring it to us, in a particular language, in their own ideological themes, and they want specific things, and they try to execute it in an unbelievably kind of tyrannical, if I can say that, fashion. Why I call it tyrannical is that they leave no room whatsoever to the African thoughts, African values, African views, cultures, traditions. They don't, at least as far as I know and as far as my research has shown me, they don't ever come in asking us what is most important to different communities where they're coming to. It is actually quite easy to find out what the African people are asking for, because sometimes when I say to people, this is not really what the African people are asking for, they ask me, how do you know? I mean, you are here, and even if you are in Nigeria, you cannot know what the African people are asking for. Actually, there is a very, I'd say, even easy way in the age of social media to find out what is most demanded, what is most needed, what the population's majority of the people are asking for. And that is exactly the same whether it's for an African nation or whether it is for a Western nation. And I am talking about politics. Politics now has become a go-to place for me, where I go to find out, take a pulse of exactly what a particular society is asking for. So for example, during a local election, or even a national election or a regional election, people are campaigning, politicians in that community or in that society, they are campaigning, as is also the case in Western nations. And during campaigns, what happens? What we find is that the politicians begin to promise people. They don't make irrelevant promises. They don't just come out of the blues and say, we're going to do this, that, and the other. The politicians have a very keen sense of what people are clamoring for or asking for, or what people desperately need. And so they make their own mandate or political promises based on that. Now, whether they end up giving what they promise or not, that's another matter for another day. But what I am saying indeed is that politicians, because they have their ways of taking the pulse of the people, they then come out and make those promises. Now, thank God for social media, because these days a lot of the political battles are being fought on social media. The same, goes the same as well for African politicians. If 3 or 4 politicians are vying to be the governor of a state, or a member of parliament for a particular district or region, they go and fight it out on social media, and they are making their promises of exactly what they are going to give. So I just have this tweet that I just picked up the other day. It's from the last presidential election in my own country. I'm from Nigeria, by the way, and this was the list of promises that was being made by the main political opponent for the presidential presidency, and look at this list and see the kind of thing that this particular candidate was promising. He's promising that he will improve the economy. He's talking about improving the security. Everybody knows what has happened in Nigeria with Boko Haram. That was the case. This was back in 2015, just before our elections, our most recent elections. But everybody has heard about the Boko Haram. It was the problem then, it is still a problem now. So he's there promising for security of the Nigerian people. He's promising employment. He is promising education. He's promising infrastructure. All these things that he's listing in this particular tweet is not just what he wants to do for the people, but it is what he has heard and he has found out that the people are clamoring for. The same goes for all the other various African countries. When you find out during their campaigns, you hear what the people are asking for. And the one thing that is prominently missing from this list, at least from my country, and is the same for most countries that I have observed, are things like sexual and reproductive health, or abortion, or any of these values that we see now being kind of vied over or fought over in Western countries. So people are in the Western countries promising that they will give unlimited abortion. They're going to extend or increase access to abortion, and so on and so forth. That could never ever come up within the context of African politics. Why is that? Because the majority of the people, no matter where they come from, no matter their clan, their tribe, their ethnic group, abhor abortion. Anytime that the African people are polled, here is a poll from the Pew Research that was done a couple of years back, where people were asked in various African countries what they think about abortion. And look at what people are saying, and look at the percentage of the people who are saying that abortion is unacceptable to them no matter what. I think my own country is about 80%. A country like Uganda is like 88% of the people saying, no way, we don't want abortion. 92% of the people who were polled in Ghana said the same thing. So how can a politician, or how dare a politician come out and say, we're going to give abortion to the people of Ghana? This is exactly why anybody who wonders, in most of the African countries, in about 80% of the African countries, in fact, without, just across the board, there are the strongest restrictions against abortion. So abortion, they continue to refuse to legalize abortion, even when people come and tell them this, that, and the other, because there is no way. They cannot make a political case for it. They cannot make a social case for it. They cannot make a cultural case for it. People are against abortion, and they continue to say that they're against abortion. The same thing goes for marriage, redefinition of marriage. The same thing goes for all these kind of things, the gender theory, some of the things that have really become like candy in Western countries, whereby one side of a political aisle continue to push for certain kinds of freedom, and I put freedom quote unquote because people perceive these as freedom. The freedom to be able to abort your own child is a thing that many within Western countries, not all of course, but now many, disturbingly so, are holding on to it as a kind of freedom, as a kind of right, in most of the Western countries. So now imagine that in these Western countries where these kinds of values or non-values, as the case may be, abortion, the hypersexualization of children, the kind of, comprehensive sexuality education, for example, that is being offered for children, things that are so inappropriate within curriculum, school curricula. Imagine that these people who are doing all of these things in the West, they are redefining things, they are redefining society, they are shifting everything, they are trying to separate people from the Christian values that were at the root of many of these countries. So imagine that now they have the control of the $50 billion that I talked about a few minutes ago that comes into Africa in the form of humanitarian aid. Imagine that these people who are so invested in these kinds of ideologies now get a hold of the money. That is what has happened now. And these are the same people who are in prominent positions. They are running prominent organizations and major organizations who are now the ones approaching African nations through international channels. So they're coming as international NGOs. They are philanthropists who have such massive foundations. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are a major stakeholder within this conversation of donor recipient when it comes to Africa. They do have branches in many of the African capitals. They are in conversation and discussion with most of our African governments. They are able to get access to a lot of the African leadership, really our top leadership. So these people who are so powerful and also at the same time so keen on their ideology and their perception of what culture should be and what family or human sexuality should be, or where life begins and things like that, they are the ones also in control of the discussion. Now, we're seeing them in our African capitals. We are seeing them hanging around our African governments. And it's so disturbing because now it's translating into conditions, and we are seeing that a lot of the projects that are tied to aid, the aid money and aid funding is now very overtly ideological. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. You see that we have seen it in the Canadian government and what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Around 2010, following a G8 that was held in Canada, the Canadian government at the time, the Harper administration, had come up with this project called the Muskoka Initiative. It does have a long name. I think it's the Muskoka Initiative for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health. So this was a funding stream, millions of dollars, which was dedicated to putting funding into helping mothers, pregnant women, newborn, as the name goes, and child health care. We saw a lot of those projects, a lot of that money going into those kinds of projects in various developing countries, of course, including African countries. But one thing that the Harper administration had done at the time was to specify that the money would never and could never go to abortion. So in other words, the Canadian government had committed to not ever fund abortion in an African country or in a developing country through the Muskoka Initiative or any other. So Canada was not really, at least as far as I know, the Canadian government were never involved in giving money to abortion organizations or abortion lobbying type groups. This money was going straight to things like providing safe delivery, providing professional baby delivery, which in many places it's not possible. So they were training up midwives, they were putting money into helping with all kinds of complications during delivery. And then as the administration had a change around 2015-2016, the Trudeau administration then came in, and of course the Trudeau administration had their own ideas about issues like abortion, about issues like sexuality education, and they took a hold of this same initiative, the Muskoka Initiative for Maternal Health, newborn and child health care. They took a hold of it and then started to review it and rebrand it. So by 2017, we saw the foreign minister for Canada talking about making the Muskoka Initiative more robust. So they were using this language of getting something more robust that will include safe abortion, that will include sexuality education, that will include adolescent-friendly family planning, and also they added on after a while something about feminism. So in other words, they then started to come up with this whole brand of the feminist foreign policy. I had never seen it before. The Trudeau administration came up with it. So they were going to be funding various feminist projects in different African countries, and of course in addition to all these other things that I had listed. This is a perfect example of how a Western country or a massive Western donor who has so much power like Canada, who has so much funding like Canada, can come into a particular country or a particular continent and offer them something completely different than anything that the people are asking for. So what we've then seen through the Canadian government funding is much money going to international organizations that are essentially sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations, International Planned Parenthood Federation, Marie Stopes International, who had put out even at one time a press release thanking the Canadian government for a gift of $4 million, and this was a one-time gift, and but they continue to fund projects and organizations like this. What this then means is that the money that could have gone to things like safe delivery, to helping to build up hospitals or fortify the health systems that are already weakened in various African countries. The money that could have gone there is now heading into the pockets of organizations that are well-known abortion providers. They are well-known sexual and reproductive rights groups. A lot of them lobby our government. So the Canadian taxpayers inadvertently are now paying to lobby African politicians in various countries to push for the legalization of abortion in places where people don't even want it. A lot of the Canadian dollars, taxpayer dollars, will be going into projects like the one that I found in Ethiopia, where the Canadian government, through I think UNICEF, they're giving money millions of dollars for a nutrition project, which of course the nutrition project is a food project, but which is then tied very firmly to what they're calling adolescent friendly family planning. So in other words, they are doing this food project that was meant to target only girls. They were looking for female children, so girls in schools and out of school, and they were running programs, or they continue to run programs. This program, I think, continues on. It started around 2017. So through this channel, they are giving food, but they are giving food that is tied to comprehensive sexuality education, as well as the sexualization of our children. So this is what the Western ideologue, who is all powerful, this is what they look like, and this is what I then have described, and many people in fact have described, as ideological neocolonialism. Is where somebody else comes in and tells you, this is, we see everything that you want, we're hearing you and we're seeing everything, we can see all this list of things that you're asking for: education, healthcare, security, employment. But don't worry, what we really care about are things like abortion and the comprehensive sexuality education of your children. What we care about is teaching your children about condoms, whereas what you're asking for is this one thing, but this is what we think is more important for you. Is a kind of paternalism. They are patronizing us, and they are treating Africans like children, but it's so much worse than that, because they are treating us like children, but they're also trying to force upon us their own ideas, their own ideals, their own ideology. The effect this has had on the general funding pattern is this graph that I found in the records of the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So this is the group, or the organization that tracks foreign aid that goes to various continents. So this particular graph depicts or shows exactly what has happened over a period of almost 20 years between Africa and Africa's donors, the kind of funding that has come for various things under the social sector foreign aid. Social sector foreign aid will include most of the things that people will perceive as foreign aid. That's the provision of water and sanitation, education, healthcare, something on government, supporting government programs, as well as what they have termed population programs. And so I found out that population programs will include things like the provision of contraception, condoms. It will go to organizations that are abortion providers, so International Planned Parenthood Federation. So these are the people who deal with the population programs. Now, if you look at the graph, I hope you all can see it. So this graph is quite an interesting one, because it does show you cumulatively over the years, and it's their own records and it's their own data. So it's good that we refer to it, that from around 1996, when the data here shows, up to when the data shows, the lowest funding was being given for the population program, which is the red line. So the population program was right at the bottom, and then you can see how it has progressed, and everything else, of course, you can see, I think the lilac one is education, the yellow one is healthcare. So just follow how the funding has gone. Now, the interesting thing is that things have been up and down. However, the one thing that continues to increase is the red line, which stands for the population program. By 2000 and around 2008, a lot of the funding for different things dropped. And I think the reason for that would be the recession, the economic recession that had happened around 2008. So a lot of the funding dropped for various things. So one cannot blame Western countries for, if you don't have money, you don't have any money to give. But it's quite interesting that the population program funding continued to increase to the point that by that 2008, that was the point when, from the data here, you can see that the highest funding was being given for population program. So in other words, the population program funding then surpassed everything else, which is an incredible thing to think about, that various African countries are asking for different things, and yet the funding for population, which is the one thing that never has come up in any of our politics, is never come up in any place where people, the majority of the people are speaking, or if you are asking a large group of people, population program would never be part of it, would never come up. But yet the largest funding has been given since 2008, because that trend continued to the point where this data runs all the way to 2013. The highest funding that is given to African nations from their Western donors, or by their Western donors, is indeed money for population programs. So this graph shows very clearly how Africa's donors have indeed prioritized the so-called SRHR, the sexual and reproductive health and rights, in their funding to Africa. And it shows you exactly how ideology can come into the humanitarian aid and completely distort everything, giving people what they haven't asked for. This is the hard truth that I'm here to expose today, and this is the hard truth that I would like people to know, is the fact that a lot of taxpayers in various Western countries do not even know, no matter what their own ideas and ideology may be, they don't even realize in many cases what their money is going to and how their money is being allocated. And the fact that whereas people within these societies that are recipients who benefit from aid money, that within these communities they're asking for various things, and yet what is being given to them is so far removed from what it is that they are asking for. And the theme of what is being given to them is being set by just a handful of people, a group of people who have the same ideas, who have the same ideologies. So I hope that that the rest of the weekend goes well for you, or the rest of this program goes well for you. I am indeed grateful to be able to bring this particular presentation to you and to share with you what, just in a little way, what I have noticed and what I have seen in various places that I've traveled to, as well as in the various studies and research that I have done, on this particular issue and on this particular topic. All right, then, God bless you. Thank you so very much for listening. And I pray and hope that we are able to come together to ask for something different, to ask that things be done differently, to ask that the people of Africa, and as well as other people within various developing countries, will be listened to, and that's how funding should be, and that's how funding should be allocated. It should be based on the real needs of the people. All right, thank you. Bye.